Hello and welcome. Today we'll be talking about cultural relativism and women's human rights. In this module section, we're considering the ways that gender violence can be understood through a feminist framework, as well as paying close attention to the role that culture plays. So let us begin by asking the question, what is culture? Culture is a way of life, traditions and customs transmitted through learning, which plays a role in molding the beliefs and behaviors of people exposed to them. Another way of understanding what culture is that it's a system of shared beliefs, values, customs, behaviors, and artifacts that members of a society embrace. Sally Engle-Mary argues that culture is contested. Not only is it contested, but it's hybrid and porous, and that it need not be a barrier to human rights. In other words, she asks that we do not treat culture as monolithic. When we treat culture as monolithic, it fails to respect important intracultural differences. Cultural relativism is a perspective where there is no one transcendent notion of universal rights throughout the world, and therefore no country or culture can impose its own notion of what is right or wrong on the rest of the world. Instead, respect for diversity and local customs should be observed. The view that behavior in one culture should not be judged by the standards of another is a cultural relativist position. When you argue that all cultures are equal, have intrinsic value, and are entitled to respect and should be appreciated for their differences, that would fall under this perspective. However, when we think of feminist perspectives and include that with a culturally relativist position, there's a bit of a danger. And that the danger of this position is that in order to follow it, it would require that feminists ignore many of the limits of women's freedoms and violations of women's bodies and their human rights. Another perspective worth considering is ethnocentric thinking. And this refers to the tendency to use one's own culture standards and values to judge the behavior and beliefs of people with different cultures. Now, the challenge of this position is that it often leads to a condemnation of cultural practices and often leads people to dismiss women as in a false consciousness. A third perspective would be a universalist position. The universalist position argues that human rights promote ideas of individual autonomy, equality, choice, and secularism, even when these ideas differ from prevailing cultural norms and practices. Now, feminist critique. Chandra Mohanty is a very well-known feminist scholar, post-colonial feminist scholar, who offers us a unique outlook on understanding culture and women's rights. She provides a post-colonial feminist critique of the Eurocentric gaze or a Western gaze. Now, what does she mean by that? She argues that when we talk about third world women, we often risk generalizing about the majority of third world women as oppressed and powerless. And so largely she's responding to academia, but also media representations of third world women. In particular, she wants to critique Western feminist scholars for making problematic generalizations about third world women. She argues that oftentimes Western feminist scholarship only sees the differences between women from various parts of the world and often portrays third world women as victims of ignorance and culture and religion. Mohanty would argue that not enough attention is paid to difference in cultural specificity and that too often some feminists are imposing Western standards. A classic example of this is when we can examine the United Nations Decade for Women and Western feminism's vision of global sisterhood. this version of global sisterhood would be critiqued in many ways because the narratives around global sisterhood often portrayed third world women as victims and as powerless while positioning Western women as liberated. So Mohanty wants us to question looking at the world and looking at women's oppression through a Western lens. For example, when you see the following political cartoon, you see the allegedly Western woman, blonde in the bikini, and it says everything covered but her eyes, what a cruel male-dominated culture. And in the following depiction of a Muslim woman, it says nothing covered but her eyes, what a cruel male-dominated culture. And I think it helps us understand that much of what we examine of women's oppression and many examples of violating women's rights need to be understood through a culturally specific lens and challenge some of the assumptions that scholars and students like yourselves may make about who is liberated and who is oppressed. Now, one of the feminist critiques that came up in your reading of human rights perspective is that women have much to lose in any movement away from a universal standard of human rights in favor of deference to culture. In other words, part of what Tiefenburn is saying is that when you adopt a cultural relativist position and defer to culture, you refuse to act on behalf of women's rights. She would advocate a universalist position that would allow us to understand the role culture can play, but still act on behalf of women's rights. She argues that human rights should be understood as important, but that we can also respect individual difference and cultures. When we introduce the case study of female genital mutilation that comes up in your readings today, it's often written about and understood theoretically and in practice as a violation of women's human rights. Now, culture plays an important role when considering female genital mutilation. The first question we're going to ask is, what's in a name? Sometimes you'll see the practice referred to as FGM, which refers to female genital mutilation, or at times FC, which is female circumcision or female cutting, FGC, which is female genital cutting. The naming matters significantly. Whether you're choosing to call a practice mutilation or cutting or circumcision goes along with a certain politics or a certain perspective or way of understanding the practice. So for example, when you use the term female genital mutilation, it implies that this is a violation of women's human rights. The practice is an example of gender violence. Whereas if you're adopting a female circumcision perspective, it might be one that would argue that it's a cultural practice. So one of the interesting things about the case of this practice is questioning about whether it should be considered a form of torture or whether it should be understood strictly as a cultural tradition. Now, I encourage you to consider what you think about this. Do you think it should be classified as gender violence? Now, when we take the theoretical perspectives that I offered you earlier in this presentation, we need to ask ourselves, how would a cultural relativist understand FGM? How would a universalist, how would an ethnocentric individual understand this practice? And I think we'll see that a cultural relativist position would insist that you understand the practice as a cultural tradition and one that cannot be judged. Now, the danger of that, according to your authors this week, is that it insists that we don't act on behalf of women's rights, women's bodies. Now, one of the things that our reading for this week asked us to consider when coming up with solutions to the practice of FGM is to understand the importance of involving traditional authority, political and religious local media, as well as practitioners, human rights groups, local police to form coalitions to enforce existing laws. There are many laws that ban or regulate the practice of female circumcision. And part of what our perspective that we're considering today is understanding the role of local individuals, women themselves, and cultural and religious leaders in order to identify solutions to improving women's human rights. Today, however, the harmful effects of FGM on women and girls have been clearly demonstrated, and the human rights implications of FGM are clearly and unequivocally recognized at an international level. So despite some of the concerns about culture, it is commonly recognized that FGM is a violation of women's human rights. Now, this recognition requires that governments, local authorities, and others in positions of power and influence honor their obligations under international law and actively work to prevent, investigate, and punish all forms of violence against women, and this would include FGM. In conclusion, human behaviors and cultural values, however senseless or destructive they appear from the personal and cultural standpoint of others, have meaning and fulfill a function for those who practice them. In other words, it's important to consider the cultural conditions that give rise to certain practices. However, culture is not static. It is in constant flux, adapting and reforming, and people will change their behavior when they understand the hazard and indignity of harmful practices, and when they realize that it is possible to give up harmful practices without giving up meaningful aspects of their culture.